Welcome to Washington Today on C-SPAN Radio for Wednesday, July 30th, 2025. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell announces no change to interest rates and says about President Donald Trump's tariff policy, higher tariffs have begun to show through more clearly to prices of some goods, but their overall effects on economic activity and inflation remain to be seen. President Trump announces more tariff rates scheduled to take effect August 1st, including 25% on India, plus an additional unspecified tariff if India buys Russian oil. U.S. economy grew at a very healthy 3% in the second quarter, April to June, according to the Commerce Department, this after shrinking in the first quarter. Bipartisan concerns at a Senate Agriculture Committee hearing about the department's reorganization plan that would send D.C. area staff to 5 regional hubs. Senate Democrats used an obscure 100-year-old law to demand the Justice Department release files in the Jeffrey Epstein sex trafficking investigation. That law requires an executive branch agency to comply with a request for information by any 5 senators on the Governmental Affairs Committee. A Senate committee approves a bill to ban stock trading by members of Congress, voting yes, all Democrats and 1 Republican. Sponsor Josh Hawley of Missouri. Republican Senator Chuck Grassley says he is disappointed and offended by President Trump's personal attacks on him for not bypassing the tradition called blue slip, by which senators can block the president's judicial and U.S. attorney nominees from their states. And the Senate confirms Emil Bove, former personal lawyer to Donald Trump, who then became a top Justice Department official, to a federal appeals court judgeship, 3rd Circuit. Story from NBC News. The Federal Reserve said Wednesday it was leaving its interest rate unchanged, a widely expected move that comes despite enormous pressure from the Trump administration to lower it. In a statement announcing the decision, the Fed said economic growth had moderated in the first half of the year, but that inflation remained somewhat elevated. 2 Federal Reserve officials, both appointed by President Donald Trump, dissented from the decision, something that has not occurred in more than 3 decades, in a sign of both the economic uncertainty and political pressure facing the central bank. That was from the NBC News article. Here's the Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell opening up his news conference at the Fed building in Washington.
My colleagues and I remain squarely focused on achieving our dual mandate goals of maximum employment and stable prices for the benefit of the American people. Despite elevated uncertainty, the economy is in a solid position. The unemployment rate remains low, and the labor market is at or near maximum employment. Inflation has been running somewhat above our 2% longer-run objective. In support of our goals, today the Federal Open Market Committee decided to leave our policy interest rate unchanged. We believe that the current stance of monetary policy leaves us well positioned to respond in a timely way to potential economic developments.
Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell, part of his opening statement at his news conference at the Fed building in Washington, D.C. During the question and answer period with reporters, he was asked about the outlook for future interest rate cuts, tariffs, and inflation.
There's a lot of lean in the markets, and not to mention out of the administration for a rate cut now in September. Is that expectation unrealistic at this point?
So, as you know, today we decided to leave our policy rate where it's been, where I would characterize as modestly restrictive. Inflation is running a bit above 2%, as I mentioned, even excluding tariff effects. The labor market's solid, historically low unemployment. Financial conditions are accommodative, and the economy is not performing as though restrictive policy were holding it back inappropriately. So it seems to me and to almost the whole committee that the economy is not performing as though restrictive policy is holding it back inappropriately, and modestly restrictive policy seems appropriate. All that said, there's also downside risk to the labor market. In coming months, we'll receive a good amount of data that will help inform our assessment of the balance of risks and the appropriate setting of the federal funds rate.
So just to follow up, by coming months, does that include the possibility you'll be getting essentially 2 rounds of jobs and inflation data between now and the September meeting? Is that potentially adequate to make a decision to lower rates at that point?
So you're right. We do have, this is an intermeeting period when we'll get 2 full rounds of employment and inflation data before the time of the September meeting. We have made no decisions about September. We don't do that in advance. We'll be taking that information into consideration and all the other information we get as we make our decision at the September meeting.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You took out the word or the notion that uncertainty has diminished from this statement. Does that mean uncertainty has increased? And I'm just wondering, the administration has struck several deals with large trading partners where it seems like we now know what the rate is going to be. Does knowing that rate add to your certainty to change policy, or do you need to wait to see the economic effects?
So essentially, the statement in our statement about uncertainty reflects what's gone on since the last meeting. So at the time of the last meeting, uncertainty had moved down a little bit, but it was more or less even this time. So we took out, had diminished because it didn't diminish further. So there's not really much in that. And then your second question is, say again?
There have been several deals that have been struck, and now we seem to have an idea what the tariff rates are going to be with some of our large trading partners. Does that not add to the kind of certainty you might need, or is it you're waiting for the economic effects to show themselves?
No, I think we're still, you're right, it's been a very dynamic time for these trade negotiations, and lots and lots of events in the intermeeting period, but we're still a ways away from seeing where things settle down. We are clearly getting more and more information, and I think at this point, people's estimates, our estimates, outside estimates of the likely, effective level of tariffs is not moving around that much at this point. But at the same time, there are many uncertainties left to resolve. So yes, we are learning more and more. It doesn't feel like we're very close to the end of that process, and that's not for us to judge. But it feels like there's much more to come, as well, looking ahead.
Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell, part of his news conference at Fed headquarters in Washington, D.C., after the announcement that the Fed is not changing interest rates after today's meeting. And Wall Street reaction, the Dow down 171, NASDAQ up 31, S&P down 7. This morning, before the Federal Reserve's decision, President Donald Trump wrote on Truth Social, second quarter GDP just out 3%, way better than expected. Too late, in quotes, must now lower the rate. No inflation, let people buy and refinance their homes. Then early afternoon, again, before the Fed's announcement that interest rates were not changing, President Trump was asked about interest rates as he was signing at the White House a bill into law to help veterans facing foreclosures on their homes.
You said that higher interest rates are making it harder for veterans to refinance. There's a stronger than expected GDP report this morning. What do you say to analysts who worry that lowering interest rates would actually lead to inflation?
Well, if that happens, then we just raise them. What you do is you lower them, and let's see if there's inflation. Right now, there's no inflation. Everybody thought there would be. All we have is billions of dollars of cash pouring into our country from other countries that took advantage of us for many, many years. They were taken advantage of. We were like the stupid people that didn't know what they were doing. They took advantage of us. Other countries, friend and foe. And by the way, the friend was oftentimes much worse than the foe when it comes to trade. So if that happens, what you do is you raise your rates and you do what you have to do to stop inflation. But we're keeping the rates high, and it's hurting people from buying houses, and we don't want that. If for any reason that happened in a year or two, if there's some signs of inflation coming back, right now there's not. We have a great thing going. I think we're going to have the richest economy you've ever seen. We have money coming in that we've never even thought about at numbers that nobody's ever seen before. We have a deal with Japan where they're going to pay us $550 billion. We have a deal with Europe where they're doing $750 billion plus $400 billion plus $300 billion. And many other countries, it's likewise, relatively, those are two big ones, but likewise. So we have a lot of money coming in, and we have no inflation, and we're very strong, and we should be lowering the rates. Each point that this gentleman keeps up costs us $365 billion a year. Think of that. 1 point, $365 billion. If you bring it down a point, we save 365. We should be the lowest interest rate, and we're not. We're 38, number 38, because of the Fed. It's all because of the Fed. He's done a bad job. Now, he's got a meeting today, but I call him too late. You know, he's always too late. Even if he does it today, probably won't. I hear they're going to do it in September, not today. For what reason? Nobody knows. But Europe, as you know, cut their rates 11 times in the last short period of time. But the good news is we're doing better than anybody anywhere in the world. Nobody's doing anything even close to us, even with the higher rates. The higher rates do affect housing, though, because people can't go out and get a loan or refinance their house. And it would be nice to have them be able to do that. That would be just another check of a box that would be important.
President Donald Trump in the White House Roosevelt Room taking reporters' questions after signing a bill dealing with veterans' mortgages. And Associated Press writing, the Fed's decision Wednesday leaves its key short-term rate at about 4.3%, where it has stood after the central bank made 3 cuts last year. Another AP story, the United States will impose a 25% tariff on goods from India, plus an additional import tax because of India's purchasing of Russian oil, President Donald Trump said Wednesday. India is our friend, Trump said on his Truth Social platform, but its tariffs on U.S. products are far too high. The article goes on. The Republican president added India buys military equipment and oil from Russia, enabling Moscow's war in Ukraine. As a result, he intends to charge an additional penalty starting on Friday as part of the launch of the administration's revised tariffs on multiple countries. Again, that was from AP. More on this from the president's news conference at the White House.
You mentioned today that India, in addition to its 25% tariff rate, would pay an additional penalty because of its support of Russia. What is that additional penalty? And are other countries facing the same threat?
Well, we're negotiating right now, and it's also BRICS. You know, they have BRICS, which is basically a group of countries that are anti the United States, and India is a member of that, if you can believe it. It's an attack on the dollar, and we're not going to let anybody attack the dollar. So it's partially BRICS, and it's partially the trade situation. It's the deficit. We had a tremendous deficit. So, as you know, Prime Minister Modi is a friend of mine, but they don't do very much business in terms of business with us. They sell a lot to us, but we don't buy from them. You know why? Because the tariff is so high. They have one of the highest tariffs in the world. Now, they're willing to cut it very substantially, but we'll see what happens. We're talking to India now. We'll see what happens. It doesn't matter too much whether we have a deal or whether we charge them a certain tariff, but you'll know at the end of this week. August 1st is a very big day for this country because money is going to pour into the United States like we've never seen before.
President Donald Trump, news conference at the White House. More from the Associated Press article. The new tariffs on India could complicate its goal of doubling bilateral trade with the U.S. to $500 billion by 2030. The two countries have had 5 rounds of negotiations for a bilateral trade agreement. While the U.S. has been seeking greater market access and zero tariff on almost all its imports, India has expressed reservations on throwing open sectors such as agriculture and dairy, which employ a bulk of the country's population for livelihood, Indian officials said. The Census Bureau reported the U.S. ran a $45.8 billion trade imbalance in goods with India last year, meaning it imported more than it exported. That was from AP. On the subject of tariffs, you heard the president say August 1st will be a big day. He wrote on Truth Social, the August 1st deadline is the August 1st deadline. It stands strong and will not be extended. A big day for America. The president also announced today through an executive order that he is imposing a universal 50% tariff on copper imports and suspending duty-free de minimis treatment for low-value shipments. And from a White House statement, today President Trump signed an executive order implementing an additional 40% tariff on Brazil, bringing the total tariff amount to 50% to deal with recent policies, practices, and actions by the government of Brazil that constitutes an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security, foreign policy, and economy of the United States. The statement says that one of those actions is harming U.S. companies, the free speech rights of U.S. persons, U.S. foreign policy, and the U.S. economy. Another, Brazil's politically motivated persecution, intimidation, harassment, censorship, and prosecution of former Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro and thousands of his supporters, saying it's a serious human rights abuse that has undermined the rule of law in Brazil, part of the White House statement. The U.S. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York, spoke today on the Senate floor about the latest economic data and tariffs.
So this morning, we got more worrying news showing how Donald Trump's administration is raising costs and sowing chaos in the economy. The New York Times headline put it succinctly: U.S. economy slowed in the first half of 2025 as tariffs scrambled data. And while the Trump administration will try to wave rosy headlines about the Q2 number, today's GDP number is in fact a mirage, because some ominous numbers lurk under the hood. Business investment plunged in the second quarter by 3.1%. The fact that business investment plunged so starkly is very troubling. It shows that already businesses are worried about growing their operations, worried about hiring more workers, worried about trading with their international partners, and worried in general about the future. And this number is another data point in a larger pattern. Donald Trump's tariffs are weighing down the U.S. economy, spiking costs for small businesses and families alike. And if Donald Trump keeps up the chaos, the dangers for the economy will continue to get worse.
Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, Democrat from New York, today on the Senate floor. This is Washington Today. CNN writes that President Trump on Wednesday will make a fresh push to improve Americans' access to their own medical records, tasking dozens of major health and technology companies with solving an issue that has long bedeviled the federal government. The plan centers on a pledge that more than 60 companies have signed, including tech giants Amazon, Apple, Google, Microsoft, and Oracle, to help develop new ways for more easily sharing patient data across the U.S.'s fragmented healthcare system. Three people familiar with the matter told CNN, and the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services later confirmed Trump is slated to tout the voluntary framework during a White House speech on Wednesday. That was from CNN. C-SPAN covered that speech. You can find the video at cspan.org. U.S. Senate Democrats held a news conference today talking about the president and congressional Republicans' policies on health care. Senator Ron Wyden, Democrat of Oregon, ranking member on the Finance Committee, said that while Medicaid cuts in the recent budget reconciliation bill, the One Big Beautiful Bill as it was called, have gotten most of the attention, he said people with private health insurance will be seeing changes soon.
Donald Trump and Republicans have been actively misleading the American people. Americans were never told that their flawed bill will punch a hole that's a lot deeper than Medicaid. Americans who have private health coverage, like through an employer, a lot of them think they're safe. That's just not true. Insurance companies are increasing premiums by the highest amount in nearly a decade. In the coming weeks, Americans who buy private health insurance are going, even the insurance people are turning the lights on. Somebody touched one of those lights. Yes, that's it. There we go. The insurance companies are increasing premiums by the highest amount in almost a decade. In the coming weeks, Americans who buy health insurance on their own are going to be mailed notices about big premium spikes. Hospitals are discussing the possibility of closing their doors or winding down services like labor and delivery. For those that have already announced their closing, that means services aren't going to be available for anybody, not just folks on Medicaid. Long-term care safety under their bill is going to be jeopardized because of reductions in nursing home staff, regardless of whether your loved one is covered by Medicaid. States are talking about cutting optional benefits like home care for kids, which is critical in families like the little lobbyists, the wonderful little lobbyists. Let's have a round of applause for them. And I'm kind of a hawk on privacy, like my friend Senator Merkley, and I can tell you your health privacy is a lot less safe as health providers provide fewer dollars and invest in some of the essential services like cybersecurity. So that's why Democrats are here today with a simple message. Let's scrap Trump care. Let's scrap these cuts.
Senator Ron Wyden, Democrat from Oregon, ranking member on the Finance Committee at a news conference with other Senate Democrats and activists. Today is the 60th anniversary of President Lyndon Johnson signing the law that created Medicaid and Medicare. The Senate Majority Leader John Thune, Republican from South Dakota, used his leader time, as it's known, at the start of today's Senate session to highlight parts of the One Big Beautiful Bill recently signed into law after being passed with only Republican votes, and he focused on taxes.
And so months before last year's elections, we started laying the groundwork for an extension of the 2017 tax relief to prevent tax hikes on hardworking Americans. But not just an extension. My Senate Republican colleagues and I were determined to ensure that this tax relief was permanent so that Americans wouldn't have to worry about their taxes going up down the road. And that, Mr. President, is what we did. The One Big Beautiful Bill makes the 2017 tax relief permanent, and it prevents a massive $4 trillion tax hike on the American people. But we didn't stop there. We didn't just make the 2017 tax relief permanent. We added to it with new measures to provide relief for hardworking Americans. We increased the child tax credit to $2,200 and indexed it to inflation so its value would never go down. We increased the standard deduction, exempting additional money from Americans' taxable income. And we added a new $6,000 bonus deduction for seniors, allowing Americans on Social Security to keep more of their money. And that's still not all, Mr. President. We eliminated taxes on tips for millions of tip workers, Uber and Lyft drivers, hairstylists and delivery drivers, servers at restaurants. We eliminated taxes on overtime pay for millions of hourly workers. That includes individuals like nurses and police officers, firefighters and paramedics, people who put in extra time away from their families to keep Americans safe. And Mr. President, the list goes on. Americans can now deduct the interest costs of a new car that's made here in America. Parents can save for their children's futures with new investment accounts funded by an initial $1,000 deposit from the government. And then there's the small business tax relief and the other measures to unleash economic growth to create new opportunities for workers.
Senate Majority Leader John Thune, Republican from South Dakota, today on the Senate floor. President Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill might backfire. The International Monetary Fund has warned, begins a Newsweek article. It continues, according to the IMF's July 2025 World Economic Outlook update. While the Trump-backed legislation has helped lift short-term U.S. growth, it could create other economic problems down the track. According to the Congressional Budget Office, the bill will add $2.4 trillion to the U.S. national debt. It also stated that the legislation reduces taxes by $3.75 trillion. That was from Newsweek. From the Hill, Deputy Agriculture Secretary Stephen Vaden took questions from the Senate Agriculture Committee on Wednesday after the agency's plan to slash its Washington offices and move staff to satellite locations across the country raised bipartisan eyebrows. Much of the panel's criticism focused on whether the administration had sufficiently notified Congress, friction that led to Senator John Bozeman, Republican of Arkansas, the committee's chair, to call the hearing on relatively short notice. The agency's plan, announced last week, would move most staff to 5 hubs in North Carolina, Missouri, Indiana, Colorado, and Utah, and wind down most of its federal buildings in Washington, D.C. That was from the Hill. Here's part of the hearing. Questions to the Deputy Agriculture Secretary, Stephen Vaden, from Senator John Hoeven, Republican of North Dakota.
We look at the 5 sites, like from my part of the world, there's nothing within 600 miles of us, from Fargo, North Dakota, for example. And we're in the heart of ag country. So my question to you is, where are we in this process? And one other point I'd make before you respond is that Secretary Rollins was in front of our Ag Appropriations Committee, and I specifically said, hey, will you work with us? Because we talked about this reorganization effort, and I said, we support the goals, but we want it to be a process where you work with Congress, with the Senate, both the Authorizing Committee and the Appropriations Committee on it, and we achieve those results together. And I think that'll help garner a lot more support for the effort. So I want to know where, and I'll be up to see you later today, we can talk some more, but I want to know where we are in this process so we can accomplish just what I'm laying out and what I think, you know, the Secretary and I had talked about previously.
Well, Senator, as I stated in my opening remarks, this is the first step, not the final step. We're now accepting feedback, and we want to hear from you, and I know I'll be speaking with you later this afternoon. I look forward to that meeting. We couldn't put offices everywhere, and we learned some lessons from the ERS NIFA relocation in Term 1. And one of the most important lessons that we learned was, instead of looking all over the map, literally, for where we should go if we're looking to relocate, the first thing we should do is see where we already are and where we already have office space available and a core set of employees. That's one of the reasons, for example, that Fort Collins, Colorado jumped to the top of our list. When we look at USDA's footprint in the state of Colorado, we not only have all of the employees in Fort Collins, but in nearby Lakeland and Denver. That just formed a natural core, particularly with Forest Service equities, that made sense for us to go ahead and build on. And there's a similar story when you look at Kansas City and when you look at Raleigh, North Carolina, and the other hubs as well. So that's what we were looking at. And while our plan does not have an office in North Dakota, one thing I will note is that nearly all of these hubs are closer to North Dakota than Washington, D.C. And so while we couldn't put a location in every state, we are bringing these hubs closer to the American people that we serve. And if you look at a map, it's kind of neat how it worked out that they're pretty evenly spaced across the center of the country, from Raleigh all the way over to Salt Lake.
The Deputy Agriculture Secretary, Stephen Vaden, questioned by Senator John Hoeven, Republican of North Dakota, at today's Agriculture Committee hearing on the department's reorganization plan. Here are the questions from Senator Amy Klobuchar, Democrat from Minnesota, the committee's ranking member.
1,600 employees have left USDA's research agencies. USDA fired many researchers, including those working on avian flu, only to later backtrack. USDA is extremely delayed in setting out funding for competitive research programs this year, as so many of my colleagues know. To me, these actions completely undermine agricultural research, just as we're seeing more and more animal diseases that are used against us in trade arrangements that hurt our producers. Senator Smith and I have seen the horrific effects of avian flu. Secretary Vaden, USDA's reorganization plan would vacate USDA research labs and eliminate or consolidate offices for the Ag Research Service, the Agricultural Statistics Service. Do you believe that vacating research sites, eliminating offices, and losing researchers will improve outcomes for farmers who depend on this research?
Senator, 91 of 94 ARS research labs are unaffected by the Secretary's memorandum. Further, the Secretary's memorandum states in its plain text that what will go on in Beltsville will take place over a period of years and in a way that does not interfere with any ongoing research. And with regard to where researchers are, I think it's important to note, as you have referenced ERS and NIFA multiple times, that during the prior administration, nearly all of the hiring that took place in those agencies was done virtually, which is to say, the employees that were hired reported to no office other than their own kitchen. And some of them who did have offices in the National Capital Region not only never reported to those offices, but moved hundreds of miles away.
Mr. Vaden, I know you will be surprised at this, but I am not interested in relitigating the pandemic right now, which spanned two administrations, the Trump administration, part one, and the Biden administration. What I want to talk about is now. Do you think that these actions are actually going to make us more competitive when it comes to ag, more competitive when we are dealing with research issues across the world? And how will you ensure that critical research projects will not suffer?
Absolutely, I do, because on a government salary, government employees cannot afford to start a quality life in Washington, D.C., but they most certainly can in Indianapolis, Indiana.
Stephen Vaden, the Deputy Agriculture Secretary, before the Senate Agricultural Committee, questioned by its ranking Democrat, Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota, on the department's reorganization plan announced by the Secretary Brooke Rollins last week. We covered this hearing, and you can find it in its entirety at our video library at cspan.org. Washington Today continues in a moment.
America marks 250 years, and C-SPAN is there to commemorate every moment, from the signing of the Declaration of Independence to the voices shaping our nation's future. We bring you unprecedented all-platform coverage, exploring the stories, sights, and spirit that make up America. Join us for remarkable coast-to-coast coverage celebrating our nation's journey like no other network can. America 250. Over a year of historic moments. Only on the C-SPAN networks.
Welcome back to Washington Today, available as a podcast on the free C-SPAN Now mobile app and wherever you get your podcasts. A few more headlines. Former Vice President and former Democratic presidential nominee Kamala Harris announcing today she will not run for California governor in 2026, saying in a statement, "I love this state, its people, and its promise. It is my home. For now, my leadership and public service will not be in elected office." WRAL-TV reports Republican National Committee Chair Mike Whatley is expected to announce his plans to run for North Carolina's open U.S. Senate seat on Thursday. People directly familiar with his plans told WRAL News. News of Whatley's expected entry to the race was reported last week, and on Wednesday, his campaign committee, Whatley for Senate, registered with the Federal Elections Commission, listing Whatley as a Republican candidate for Senate. That was from WRAL. On the Democratic side, former Governor Roy Cooper announced earlier this week he'll run for that open Senate seat. And from the Texas Tribune, Texas Republican lawmakers released their first draft of the state's new congressional map Wednesday, proposing revamped district lines that attempt to flip 5 Democratic seats in next year's midterm elections. The new map targets Democratic members of Congress in the Austin, Dallas, and Houston metro areas and in South Texas. That was from the Texas Tribune. Story from CNBC, a group of Senate Democrats on Wednesday cited an obscure law to ask the Justice Department to hand over criminal investigative files related to sex offender Jeffrey Epstein to the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee by August 15th. The request is the latest salvo in an effort by Democrats and some Republicans in Congress to press the Trump administration to release the so-called Epstein files after reneging on its earlier promises to do so. 8 senators signed a letter to Attorney General Pam Bondi seeking the files, Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, and all 7 Democrats who sit on the committee. The letter cites a section of federal law that says that an executive agency shall submit any information requested of it relating to any matter within the jurisdiction of the committee when sought by any 5 members of the Senate Governmental Affairs panel. That was from the CNBC article. One of those Democratic senators, Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut, spoke about this at a news conference.
This letter has the force of law. This letter invokes a statute that has been little used because it has been unnecessary in the past to enforce transparency. It's necessary now because this administration is stonewalling and stalling and concealing. And the American people are rightly asking, what do they have to hide? What's at stake here is not just the president's promises, although they are absolutely clear when he said, quote, President Trump says he will declassify the 9/11 files, JFK files, and Epstein files, end quote. That's President Trump. What's at stake here is more than the president's promises. It's the credibility of our justice system and the question whether there was proper criminal prosecution, whether it was complete and full, whether it was accurate, and what additional facts the American people are entitled to know. What's at stake is also the victims. This crime by Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell was not a victimless crime. It was not just about money laundering. It was not just about lying to the government. It was about exploiting women, in fact, girls. Girls who were mercilessly and repeatedly subject to abuse and trafficking. And that is why the American people have a right to know who else was involved whether the system really was rigged in favor of the rich and powerful, which is what the suspicion has been on the part of a lot of the president's supporters, and why they so enthusiastically greeted his promises of full disclosure. He's broken those promises. We're going to enforce the law to make him fulfill his commitments to be transparent and full in disclosure.
Senator Richard Blumenthal, Democrat from Connecticut, at a news conference with other Senate Democrats who signed this letter invoking the Rule of Five law dating from the 1920s. 85 senators from the Governmental Affairs Committee requesting information from an executive branch agency within the jurisdiction of the committee, and it must be turned over. CNN writing about this, the Justice Department is not expected to comply with the demand for the Epstein files, according to a source familiar with its thinking. The Democrats' likelihood of success will hinge in part on the willingness of the Trump administration to put the information out, as a court fight would be unlikely to force the documents over to Congress. That's because Congress has struggled for years, especially during Trump's presidencies, to obtain documents and information from the executive branch. That was from CNN. Story from Business Insider: a bill to ban politicians from trading stocks in office moved one step closer to a vote, but only after an hour of intense argument and insults between Republicans. The Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee passed the bill on an 8-7 vote. All Democrats voted for it, while every Republican voted against it except one, Josh Hawley of Missouri, who sponsored the bill. The legislation is broadly similar to a bill that passed the same committee last summer but never received a Senate floor vote. This version would ban members of Congress, the president and vice president, from buying stocks immediately upon enactment, and would block them from selling stocks beginning 90 days after that. It would then require lawmakers to divest entirely from their stock holdings at the beginning of their next term, and it would require the president and vice president to do so beginning in 2029, after President Donald Trump's current term. It would also not allow for blind trusts, which sets it apart from other similar bills. That was from the Business Insider article. Here is Senator Josh Hawley at today's committee meeting in favor of his bill.
We have an opportunity here today to do something that the public has wanted us to do for decades, and that is to ban members of Congress from profiting on information that, frankly, only members of Congress have in the buying and selling of stock. 86% of Americans say that members of Congress should not be able to buy and sell shares of stock, individual stock, while they are members of this body, and they are absolutely correct. And the reason is, you can see it, there was just another ethics referral in the House last week. We've seen the former Speaker of the House make millions of dollars in profits. We've seen members of both parties, I'm sad to say, be investigated for their stock trades. And the reason for all of this is that, quite frankly, members of this body are privy to information that the normal person just is not. Now, is that insider trading? It is not under the laws. Sometimes people say, well, we already have insider trading laws. We don't need a stock ban. Well, the information that members of Congress are privy to is technically not covered by the insider trading laws, but nobody really believes that the information that we get isn't valuable. It is quite valuable, which is why back during COVID, you saw members of Congress of both parties engage in a flurry of stock trading right after they were getting COVID briefings. Were members of the public getting those briefings? They were not. Were members of the public privy to the kind of information that was being given to members of Congress? No, they were not. And so when you look at what members of Congress are privy to, what they are able to trade on, the access that they have, it's just qualitatively different than your average Joe or Jane, which is why we ought to put into place common sense guardrails that say, if you want to be a member of Congress, you can put you want to save, great. You can buy mutual funds, you can buy broadly diversified investment vehicles. You should not be able to buy and trade individual stock shares, in which, frankly, we have an interest in the work that we do. We have information that no other people get, no other members of the public have. This bill would finally redress that. It is in substance identical to the bill that the committee passed last year. And I believe it is a huge step forward in finally addressing this problem. I urge a yes vote, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Josh Hawley, Republican from Missouri, at today's Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee meeting. Senator Ron Johnson, Republican of Wisconsin, spoke against the bill.
One of the big problems we have here in Washington, D.C. is there's so very few bureaucrats, staff members, members of Congress who have any experience in, which means very little knowledge of, and I would say very little sympathy for the private sector. How difficult it is to run a business, how much more difficult our laws, and we passed a bunch from here again today, make it to build a business, to produce products, to create great paying jobs. It's a hard thing to do. And we make it very unattractive for people to step up to the plate and run for office or potentially serve in office. I tried hiring a retired CFO many years ago. This after the passage of the Stock Act. Would have been great. I could have had somebody really expert in international taxation, that type of thing. I could not find anybody willing to do it. So this piece of legislation, really, it's legislative demagoguery. We do have insider trading laws. We have financial disclosure. Trust me, we have financial disclosure. The press pays attention to it. So I don't see the necessity of this. I can imagine all kinds of unintended consequences. You could relabel this law, quite honestly, the Career Politician Protection Act, because it'll make it so unattractive for people to give up their business, sell it, unless some ethics committee says, oh, no, there won't be a conflict of interest. I mean, when we pass a tax law that lowers tax rates, we all benefit. It's just an inherent issue. So again, we have plenty of protections. We have the disclosure. This is a completely unnecessary piece of legislation.
Senator Ron Johnson, Republican of Wisconsin, at the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee meeting on this bill. Story from Politico about it. In an apparent attempt to sink the bill among Democrats, Committee Chair Rand Paul, Republican of Kentucky, argued the legislation should apply to President Trump, not just future presidents, and suggested his Democratic colleagues would be voting to protect the incumbent if they supported the revised bill. Paul later called it the exemption for Donald Trump's substitute. Democrats ultimately voted to alter the bill to exempt Trump, an apparent concession to appease Hawley and secure its passage. That was from Politico. Here is the committee chair, Senator Rand Paul.
The substitute protects Donald Trump. So basically, you're asking the bill currently would affect Donald Trump. So if Democrats are pondering this, you will be voting to protect Donald Trump if you vote for this substitute. We are going to have a recorded vote on this. Look, if this is a great bill, if this is the greatest thing since sliced bread and it's really necessary, it should apply to Donald Trump. But the fact that they don't want to apply it to Donald Trump means that it's a really crummy bill and it would do terrible things to Donald Trump's finances. So if this is a great bill, let's apply it to the president. And you will have a chance on that. So we will have a vote. And the next vote is going to be on the substitute. The substitute protects Donald Trump. The original bill does not protect Donald Trump. And so I hope everybody will think about that. I will oppose the substitute change because I think it should apply to everybody or nobody.
Senator Rand Paul, Republican of Kentucky, chair of the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee at today's meeting. Again, the Politico article read that Democrats ultimately voted to alter the bill to exempt President Trump in an apparent concession to appease Hawley and secure its passage. Article also says that Senator Lisa Slotkin, Democrat of Michigan, said she would have preferred not to have the exception for Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance, but added she was willing to make the good work instead of waiting for the perfect. She said, we all saw Vance and Trump come out against this publicly, but I think it's important that we at least make a start. Reporting from Politico. Later in the day, President Trump was asked at the White House, he was holding a news conference signing an unrelated bill, what he thought of this bill.
Senator Hawley introduced legislation that would ban members of Congress from owning or trading individual stocks. It extends to the president and to the vice president. Are you in favor of that legislation?
Well, I like it conceptually. I don't know about it, but I like it conceptually. And, Nancy Pelosi became rich by having inside information. She made a fortune with her husband, and I think that's disgraceful. So in that sense, I'd like it, but I'd have to really see I study these things very carefully, and this just happened. So I'll take a look at it. But conceptually, I like it. And what I do think is Nancy Pelosi should be investigated because she has the highest return of anybody practically in the history of Wall Street, save a few. How did that happen? It happened by she knows exactly what's going to happen, what's going to be announced. She buys stock, and the stock goes up after the announcement's made. And she ought to be investigated. President Trump at the White House answering reporters' questions after signing a bill not related to that topic. Story from the Hill. Senator Chuck Grassley, Republican of Iowa, the Senate's president pro tem and chair of the powerful Judiciary Committee, said he was offended and disappointed
by the tirade President Trump unleashed against him on social media over the obscure Senate tradition of respecting blue slip objections to nominees tapped to serve as district court judges and U.S. attorneys. Trump reposted an item on Truth Social calling for term limits and to dethrone the kings. The post noted Grassley, 91 years old, has served in Congress for more than 50 years, while Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer has served in Congress for 44 years, and former Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell has served for more than 40 years. The president also reposted a Truth Social post that accused Grassley of being a rhino, short for Republican in name only, and sneaky. That was from The Hill. Senator Grassley spoke at the beginning of today's Judiciary Committee hearing on judicial nominations.
Last night, I was surprised to see President Trump on Truth Social go after me and Senate Republicans over what we call the blue slip. Now, to people in the real America, not here in this Washington, D.C. and island surrounded by reality, the people in real America don't care about what the blue slip is, but in fact it impacts in their states the district judges who serve their communities and the U.S. attorneys who ensure the law and order is enforced. I was offended by what the president said, and I'm disappointed that it would result in personal insults.
Senator Chuck Grassley, Republican of Iowa, Judiciary Committee Chair, at the start of today's hearing on judicial nominations. One of President Trump's posts on Truth Social read, Chuck Grassley, who I got elected to the U.S. Senate when he was down by a lot in the great state of Iowa, could solve the blue slip problem we are having with respect to the appointment of highly qualified judges and U.S. attorneys with a mere flick of the pen. Democrats like Schumer, Warner, Kaine, Booker, Schiff, and others, sleazebags all, have an ironclad stoppage of great Republican candidates. That was the post from President Trump. Story from NBC News. The Republican-led Senate voted Tuesday to confirm Emil Bove as a judge of the Third U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals, granting a lifetime appointment to President Donald Trump's former personal lawyer. He was confirmed 50-49 with only Republican votes as they set aside allegations from 3 whistleblowers about the conduct of Bove, a Justice Department official, which included accusations that he flouted laws and Justice Department procedures. Just 2 Republicans voted with Democrats against the nomination, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska and Susan Collins of Maine. That was from NBC News. Senator Grassley spoke on the Senate floor Tuesday afternoon before the Tuesday night confirmation vote about that 3rd whistleblower's accusations.
It wasn't until Monday morning, so you got Friday, Saturday, Sunday, Monday morning, that my staff received any information. Even then, it was bits and pieces of information created by lawyers, not original information. My staff tried over and over to get all the information, only to be rejected. My staff was not shown the underlying transcript of the meeting until this morning. They were shown what was represented to be verbatim transcript of a meeting, but we still didn't have access to the underlying source. So what did I do? I followed my usual process. I asked Mr. Bove to respond to the allegations that his testimony was inconsistent with the evidence that we saw for the first time Monday. And he sent me a letter doing just that. I plan to make that letter public. I've also asked permission to make this transcript public as well, but I don't know whether the lawyer will give me that permission. In his letter, Mr. Bove flatly denies the allegations that he misled the committee. He explained that he testified truthfully in response to, quote, compound yes or no questions that sought to attribute words to me that I did not use during the February 14th, 2025 video meeting, end of quote. He also responds to the attacks on his character and rejects the allegations against him. Viewed in light of the transcript, Bovey's responses to compound hostile questions about specific words used in a meeting that happened months before his hearing do not, to me, indicate deliberately false and misleading testimony. And more importantly, the substance of the meeting itself does not reflect misconduct. It reflected a sympathetic tone during a turbulent time and appropriately characterizes the role of a Justice Department attorney. In the meeting, Mr. Bovey specifically acknowledged that being a Justice Department attorney means, quote, following orders from the President or the Attorney General unless we view them as unlawful or unethical, end of quote. He apologized to the attorneys present for tension and told them, quote, I don't want to put pressure on you, end of quote.
Senator Chuck Grassley, Republican of Iowa, chair of the Judiciary Committee on the Senate floor on Tuesday, ahead of the vote to confirm Emil Bovey for a federal appeals court judgeship. After Senator Grassley spoke, Senator Dick Durbin, Democrat from Illinois, the Judiciary Committee ranking member, responded.
I wanted to make a very brief response about whistleblowers. Senator Grassley of Iowa is recognized for his working with whistleblowers in a constructive way throughout his Senate career. I don't question that. In this particular case, Mr. Bovey seeking an appellate court position came before the committee, and we were contacted by a whistleblower who worked with him at the Department of Justice. This man has now been disclosed and identified. He wanted to give us information which he said contradicted the testimony of Mr. Bovey before the Senate Judiciary Committee. He was willing to appear before the Judiciary Committee, chaired by Senator Grassley, under oath and tell us his side of the story. I don't think you could ask for much more than someone who subject themselves to possible perjury charges or misleading the committee and do so under oath. I think he was a credible person. I'm sorry the Republicans on the committee rejected his offer. It would have brought more truth to light.
Senator Dick Durbin on the Senate floor Tuesday. The Senate later voted Tuesday to confirm Emil Bovey for a federal appeals court judgeship, Third Circuit, 50-49. The Senate is continuing to work through confirmation votes of judges and executive branch officials this week, at least through Friday, according to the schedule, although the Senate Majority Leader John Thune has left open the possibility of going into the weekend, maybe beyond, into the August recess to clear the backlog created because Democrats are using what time is available under the rules for these nominations. Confirmed today, along party lines, Ohio Solicitor General T. Elliott Gazard to be Assistant Attorney General for Legal Policy at the Justice Department, 53-45. Also, votes scheduled for Joseph Kent to be the director of the National Counterterrorism Center. Thanks for listening to Washington Today. Sign up for C-SPAN's evening newsletter word for word and get the stories making headlines in Washington emailed to you every day. Subscribe at cspan.org/connect. Have a good night.